Benita Alexander quit her job at NBC on a Wednesday. She had worked there for 20 years. She was an award-winning producer. She gave up her salary, her career, her identity for a man. For a surgeon. For the most celebrated doctor in the world, who had promised her a wedding in Italy, officiated by Pope Francis, attended by the Obamas, the Clintons, Andrea Bocelli, John Legend, and Russell Crowe. The next morning, she received an email from a colleague. The subject line was 2 words, the Pope. The article inside explained that Pope Francis would not be in Rome on July 11, 2015. He would be in South America. He had no plans to officiate any wedding. He had never heard of Paolo Macchiarini. Benita sat with that email for a long time. Then she started making calls. And what she uncovered when she started pulling the threads of the man she had loved for 2 years was not just a lie about a wedding. It was not just a fabricated romance. What she found, underneath the fake Pope and the fake guest list and the fake Vatican summer residence, was something that made all of that irrelevant. Paolo Macchiarini's patients were dying, one by one, in the operating theaters of the most prestigious medical institution in the world, while he published papers saying they were recovering, while the Nobel Prize committee watched and did nothing. 7 of his 8 patients died. And for 4 years, nobody stopped him. Paolo Macchiarini was born in 1958 in Italy. By the time he was 50, he had built the kind of career that makes other doctors feel inadequate. Thoracic surgery, regenerative medicine, research positions across Europe and the United States, a visiting professorship at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, the institution that every single year awards the Nobel Prize in Medicine. He was tall. He was charming. He had the precise, unhurried confidence of a man who has spent decades doing things nobody else can do. Colleagues described him in language that does not usually apply to surgeons. Magnetic, visionary, larger than life. In 2008, he performed an operation that made international headlines. A young woman in Barcelona needed a new trachea, the windpipe, the organ that connects the throat to the lungs. Without it, she would die. A donor organ was found, stripped of its original cells, and seeded with the patient's own stem cells, her own biology growing into a new structure, her own body rebuilding itself around a scaffold. It worked. The patient recovered. The medical press called it a revolution. Paolo Macchiarini was called a pioneer. The world had no reason to doubt him. The Karolinska Institute had no reason to doubt him. The Nobel Committee Secretariat, whose members would later be implicated in protecting him, had no reason to doubt him. He was a miracle surgeon. Everyone said so. He had the papers to prove it. The next operation was different. In 2011, a man named Andemariam Beyene arrived at the Karolinska University Hospital. He was 36 years old. He was an Eritrean student completing a master's degree in Iceland. He had been diagnosed with tracheal cancer. His doctors had recommended palliative care treatment to manage his death, not prevent it. Macchiarini offered something different. A fully synthetic trachea. Not a donor organ stripped and reseeded. A plastic tube, a nanocomposite scaffold, coated with Beyene's own bone marrow cells. Something that had never been tried in a human being. Something that had, in animal trials, shown inconsistent results. Beyene agreed. He was dying. What did he have to lose? The surgery was performed. Macchiarini published the results in the Lancet, one of the most respected medical journals on Earth. The paper described Beyene as having an almost normal airway, growing new tissue. Improving, the paper was read by doctors around the world. It was cited by researchers. It was used to justify the next operation, and the one after that. What the paper did not say was what was actually happening inside Andemariam Beyene's body. The synthetic trachea was failing. The plastic scaffold was not integrating. His body was not growing around it, it was fighting it. Infection after infection. Complication after complication. The trachea came loose. Andemariam Beyene died in 2014. His autopsy showed the synthetic trachea had never worked. Not for a single day of the 3 years he had carried it inside him. But by the time Beyene died, Macchiarini had already operated on 2 more patients at the Karolinska, and more in Russia, and one in the United States, a baby girl named Hannah Warren, 2 years old, born without a trachea, who died 3 months after her operation from postoperative complications. Each surgery was justified by the last. Each paper built on the previous one. The data described patients who were improving. The reality was patients who were deteriorating in ways that would only become visible after they were dead. A professor named Pierre Dallaire watched all of this from Belgium. He was a respiratory surgeon at KU Leuven. He had been watching synthetic trachea research for years, and he knew from basic biology, from the fundamental mechanics of how organs integrate with human tissue, that what Macchiarini was claiming was impossible. If I had the option of a synthetic trachea or a firing squad, he would later say, I would choose the firing squad, because it would be the least painful form of execution. He submitted a formal report to the Karolinska Institute. He told them what he believed was happening. He told them that the science did not add up, that the papers did not match reality, that patients were being operated on under false premises. The Karolinska Institute investigated. They found Paolo Macchiarini not guilty of scientific misconduct. They were wrong. They knew they were wrong, and they buried it anyway. Why would one of the world's leading medical institutions protect a surgeon whose patients were dying? The answer requires understanding what the Karolinska Institute actually was in 2011. Not just a university, not just a hospital, but the institution that decides every year who receives the Nobel Prize in Medicine, the most prestigious award in science, the thing that defines globally what legitimate medicine looks like. Urban Lendahl was the secretary of the Nobel Committee for Medicine. He was also deeply involved in recruiting Paolo Macchiarini to the Karolinska. When the questions began, when the reports were filed, when the whistle was blown, Lendahl was one of the people who needed the questions to go away. Because if Macchiarini was a fraud, then the Karolinska had invited a fraud into the institution that defines medical legitimacy. The institution that decides what is real in medicine had failed to notice that one of its own surgeons was performing experiments on dying patients and calling it treatment. Urban Lendahl resigned in February 2016. The Nobel Committee's secretary, gone, because of a surgeon whose patients he had helped recruit and whose misconduct he had helped ignore. He was not the only one. The vice-chancellor of the Karolinska resigned. The chief executive of the hospital resigned. One after another, the people who had stood between Paolo Macchiarini and accountability stepped aside, not because they had acted correctly, but because they had not. Now go back to Benita Alexander. She met him in 2013. She was an NBC producer working on a segment about Macchiarini's revolutionary surgery. She flew to Boston to interview him at a conference. She was serious, professional, no nonsense. People who knew her said she was focused, intense, not the kind of person who was easily impressed. Paolo Macchiarini walked into the bar where they were having a preliminary coffee, and something shifted. He was attentive in a way she had not experienced. He remembered details from conversations. He showed up places she hadn't told him she'd be. He arranged surprises, flowers, reservations, trips with the seamless coordination of someone who had done this many times and had learned exactly how it worked. He told her he was the Pope's personal doctor, that he operated on the Clintons, on the Obamas, that he was part of a clandestine network of elite physicians who were on call for the world's most powerful people, and that this network operated in total secrecy because secrecy was the point. She was a journalist, an award-winning investigative producer. She had spent her career interrogating sources, verifying claims, identifying deception. She believed him. This is not a story about a naive woman. This is a story about a man who had spent decades practicing deception in the most high-stakes environment on Earth, the operating theater, and had learned that confidence, delivered at the right moment, with the right level of specific detail, could override almost any rational objection. He proposed on Christmas 2013. She said yes. The wedding planning began in 2014. And this is where Paolo Macchiarini built the most elaborate lie of his career. He told Benita that he had spoken to his contacts at the Vatican. That Pope Francis, a progressive pope, he explained, one who wanted to change the Church's position on divorce, had agreed to marry them, to officiate the ceremony personally, as a statement, as a gesture toward a more inclusive Catholicism. He told her the Vatican had offered them the Pope's summer residence at Castel Gandolfo for the celebration. 4 days of events. He said Andrea Bocelli would sing in the church. John Legend would play at the ceremony. The guest list, he said, would include the Obamas, the Clintons, the Beckhams, Elton John, Russell Crowe. Benita had 4 dresses made, 1 for each day. Her friends and family bought plane tickets to Italy, hundreds of them. And on May 13, 2015, her last day at NBC, the day she gave up her career to follow this man to Europe, she felt, despite everything, that she was doing the right thing. The next morning, the email arrived. The Pope was in South America. She called the castle in Italy where guests were supposedly booked. Nobody had heard of Paolo Macchiarini. She hired a private investigator. The investigator found that Paolo Macchiarini was still married, had been married for 29 years, had a wife and children in a house in Barcelona with a pool and a view of the Mediterranean. There had never been a papal connection. No Bocelli, no Clintons, no summer residence, no wedding. Benita Alexander put on a blonde wig. She drove to Barcelona with 2 friends. She waited in the car while her friends walked to the door. A woman came out of the house with 2 small children. Paolo stood in the doorway. He looked, one witness said, like an embarrassed schoolboy. Benita did not get out of the car. She had seen enough. She could have stayed silent. She had already lost everything: her job, her plans, 2 years of her life. She could have absorbed the humiliation privately and moved on. Instead, she started making a different set of calls. Not to Paolo, not to the Vatican, to the colleagues who had filed misconduct reports against him, to the doctors at the Karolinska who had been trying to be heard for years, to the families of the patients. I loved him, she said later. I was furious about what he did to me and to my daughter. But the thought that this man has people's lives in his hands, that people could be dying because of this man, I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't crawl under the covers. A 3-part documentary aired on Swedish television in 2016. Macchiarini was shown the evidence. He denied it. He called his accusers envious. He said the science was sound. He said the patients had been properly informed. He said everything he always said, with the same flat confidence that had worked every time before. It did not work this time. The Karolinska Institute reversed its earlier decision. The 6 papers he had published on the synthetic trachea were retracted. The vice-chancellor resigned. The Nobel Committee secretary resigned. Swedish prosecutors reopened the investigation. Paolo Macchiarini was charged with aggravated assault. In 2023, the Svea Court of Appeal convicted him. 7 of his 8 synthetic trachea patients were dead. There is a question that sits at the center of this case and does not go away. How did he keep operating? He performed his first synthetic trachea surgery in 2011. The first whistleblower report was filed in 2014. The Karolinska initially cleared him. The second round of reports came. He was cleared again. In the meantime, he operated in Russia where there were no oversight bodies asking questions. He operated in the United States. He continued publishing papers. He continued receiving invitations to conferences. He continued receiving standing ovations. The answer is that the institution had too much invested in him to stop him. The Karolinska had staked its reputation on his work. The Nobel Prize Committee members had used their positions to recruit him. The hospitals that had invited him to operate had announced his surgeries as breakthroughs. To admit that he was wrong would have been to admit that they were wrong. And no institution, not a hospital, not a university, not a prize committee, finds that easy to do. They find it easier to question the people asking the questions, to find procedural reasons why the reports are insufficient, to wait. Waiting, in this case, had a body count. The 4 doctors who filed the original misconduct reports who had been right all along about everything were not celebrated as whistleblowers. They were investigated themselves, examined for their own conduct, questioned about their motives. This is what institutions do when they are protecting themselves. They make the people asking questions feel like the problem. Paolo Macchiarini is in prison. He was convicted. He will serve his sentence probably in Spain, in the house with the pool and the view of the Mediterranean, wearing an electronic tag. That is the other detail. Sweden's prison authorities are likely to transfer his sentence there. Because of his address. Because of EU rules. Because the system, even at the end, finds ways to be gentle with the people it has already been too gentle with. The Karolinska Institute has issued apologies. It has updated its procedures. It has a whistleblower function now. It has committees and guidelines and documents that explain how this will not happen again. Andemariam Beyene cannot read them. Hannah Warren, the 2-year-old girl who received a synthetic trachea in Illinois and died 3 months later, cannot read them. The patients in Russia, whose outcomes were never fully documented, because Russia does not have independent oversight bodies asking questions about foreign surgeons performing experimental procedures, their families cannot read them. 7 people received a synthetic trachea from Paolo Macchiarini. 7 people died. And for 4 years, the institution that decides what is real in medicine decided, every time it was asked, that nothing was wrong. That is the verdict. Not about one surgeon, about what happens when reputation becomes more important than truth. When the people with the authority to stop something have too much to lose by stopping it. When the whistleblowers are investigated and the fraud is cleared and the papers are published and the patients die and the conference invitations keep arriving and the standing ovations keep happening and nobody, for 4 years, says the thing that everyone in that building already knew. Paolo Macchiarini told Benita Alexander that the Pope would marry them. He told his patients that the synthetic trachea would save them. He was wrong about both. The difference is that Benita Alexander is alive to talk about it. I will see you in the next one.